At all stages of a lifter's training career, the outcome goal is still the same. We want to maximize muscle growth. However, what we do in the gym to achieve this will likely look different between beginner versus advanced lifters. So in this video, we will cover how training should generally differ between lifters of different experience levels. First, we need to define what exactly we mean when referring to beginner versus intermediate versus advanced lifters. While there are no specific definitions of each stage, there are a few characteristics which are common to each lifting level. Let's now cover how each phase can be generally characterized. First, we have beginners. This is the easiest level to describe because there is a clear point from when lifters haven't been training consistently before and then when they begin lifting consistently. So clearly, when lifters first start getting into the gym is the starting point of the beginner phase. While there is no strict time frame defining how long the beginner stage lasts, it usually lasts around 6 months to 1 year, depending on how consistent trainees are at their lifting practices. During this phase, trainees will often see improvements in lifting performance every single session or every week. They will also see noticeable visual improvements in their physique in a short-term time frame. These trainees are also more likely to be able to see significant muscle growth and fat loss occurring at the same time. If trainees have been consistent throughout this initial 6 to 12 months of lifting, they may make it to the intermediate phase. This is when lifters essentially feel like they have reached their very first stalling point. Lifting performance is no longer progressing every single week, and visual changes aren't as noticeable anymore. However, this isn't really a stalling point, it is a normal occurrence of being a consistent trainee for a long time. Although this can be somewhat disheartening, it just means we now need to get a little smarter and more nuanced about our training approach. Progression in performance and visual appearance can still be noticeable, although it won't be on a weekly basis, it will more so be on a monthly or multi-monthly basis. The intermediate phase would usually be from around the 6 to 12 month mark, up to around our 3rd to 5th year of training, assuming we have been consistent over time. And the last phase that lifters enter is the advanced stage. This is where any performance changes or visual improvements take multiple months or even years to see. Progress is extremely slow and isn't really noticeable in the short term. When entering this stage, trainees can sometimes feel like they are trying everything to improve and are going nowhere. However, they are likely still improving, but the timescale is just much larger. This phase would usually start around 4 to 5 years of consistent training and will last the rest of the lifter's career. So lifters who are into the lifting lifestyle for the long term will likely spend the majority of their training career in this advanced stage. So as we can now understand, there aren't really any strict definitions of each stage. Rather, each phase is fluid and lifters can even shift back and forth between phases depending on their training routines and consistency. For example, if an advanced lifter took a few months off training, they would probably act as a beginner again for the first few weeks getting back into the gym. Furthermore, experience level is not based on muscularity or strength levels either. This is because a beginner trainee could be genetically gifted and have more muscle mass and strength compared with an advanced lifter who has been training for over a decade. So it should just be understood that there aren't any strict rules here, these are just very general guidelines. So now that we understand the general differences between these phases, let's now cover how training may differ between each stage. The first factor related to training is actually your motive for lifting. Why are you in the gym in the first place, and what do you want to get out of it? For beginner lifters, this is usually for an external short-term goal. Trainees may want to look better for an upcoming event, or they may want to be more attractive to other people. Motivation for this usually comes from willpower, inspiration from other people they have seen, or maybe even because they dislike something about themselves. However, this motive for lifting is usually short-lived and doesn't provide a sustainable foundation for long-term success. So during the intermediate phase, the motive will generally shift a little bit. Trainees usually realize that even if they have made significant progress in the gym, it doesn't usually resolve all of their life problems, and it doesn't really have the same external effect that they were hoping for. So if lifters have come to this realization and find a way to continue lifting, it is usually because their motives have shifted. During the intermediate stage, lifters are probably more internally motivated. They may simply enjoy lifting, they may have made friends at the gym, and they are bought into the concept of slow and consistent progress. At this stage, trainees don't need as much external motivation to train. It is probably a part of their routine at this point, and they simply enjoy the discipline and effort that it takes to make progress. But once again, tangible progress doesn't last forever, and the motive to continue lifting shifts once again. This is when lifters enter the advanced stage, and progression is coming at a very slow rate. So the motive to train usually shifts even more internal. Trainees at this stage probably don't even have a well-defined reason for lifting. At this point, the motive is probably more to do with factors such as mental and physical health and well-being, a love for the hardships and lessons that lifting teaches us, and simply the enjoyment of the whole lifting lifestyle. These trainees are probably less concerned with external validation and do it for their own personal reasons, whatever that may be. The next factor to differentiate between experience levels is the rigidity of the lifting routine. This refers to how strictly training variables are prescribed in a training program. This is an interesting one because unlike most other factors, it doesn't gradually shift from one extreme to the other, it probably circulates back to where it started to some extent. Let's now explain what we mean by this. At the beginner stage, the training routine probably shouldn't be too rigid. This is because we want the lifter to develop a consistent training routine that works for their individual lifestyle. Furthermore, we want to constantly reinforce success at this stage to keep them coming back to the gym consistently. If they don't enjoy the lifting process, they may quit altogether and never return back. So having a rigid routine is probably not a good idea because it forces them into something that they must stick to. And if they miss a session or don't hit certain numbers that were prescribed, it will be framed as a failure. However, if we just program a very simple routine, such as go to the gym 2 to 3 times per week and do a circuit of these 10 machines, then there is lots of room for error. So as long as they make it into the gym, they have pretty much been successful already, which builds confidence in themselves. Furthermore, beginner lifters don't need to do anything particularly nuanced to make progress. They can pretty much do anything and they will improve rapidly. So there is no need to confuse or overwhelm them with advanced principles of training. However, as a lifter becomes more experienced and enters the intermediate stage, the routine probably needs to become more rigid and prescriptive. This is because progress isn't being made every single week, so trainees need to put a little more thought and effort into their program. These lifters may want to prescribe exact exercises, numbers of sets, rep ranges, proximity to failure, and have a planned progression model. Performance should probably be tracked to see if lifting performance is improving over time, and measurements may be used to assess body composition changes. This rigidity is necessary to ensure trainees understand which variables are having what impact on training outcomes. However, as we enter the advanced stage, training prescription usually becomes less rigid. Probably not as vague as the beginner stage, maybe somewhere between the beginner and intermediate level of detail. This is because lifters have enough experience at this point to know what works for them and what doesn't. Furthermore, advanced lifters have probably developed a routine over the years that suits their individual lifestyle and works well for them. Advanced lifters are also better able to auto-regulate their training if needed. They may change volume or rep ranges of lift within a session based on how they are feeling, or if a variable outside of the gym influenced their mental or physical state. So at this stage, a rigid program probably doesn't help them too much, and it may even have negative consequences in some cases. Next, let's move on to lifting technique. This is quite a simple one to cover because it is essentially the same for all experience levels. Simply put, strict and effective technique should always be one of the highest priorities for any lifter focused on muscle growth. From beginners to advanced lifters, we should never let other factors get in the way of good technique for the sake of our ego. The only difference between the beginner up to the advanced stage is our execution. As we gain more and more experience, we usually become more and more effective at executing each lift. In other words, our technique becomes better. This is something that can always be improved even after decades of lifting. We should always be aiming to maximize tension on the target muscle with each lift we perform, regardless of our experience level. Furthermore, beginners should probably start out with more of a textbook style technique that is universally considered good technique. And then as lifters become more advanced, they should start to slightly modify technique in a way that suits their individual anatomical structure and provides the best stimulus for them. Next, let's move on to how volume may differ with experience level. When discussing volume in this video, we are referring to the total number of sets performed per muscle group per week. As a beginner, volume doesn't need to be very high at all. This is because doing anything is more than you were previously doing, so the stimulus is completely novel and lifters will see some muscle growth regardless of how many sets they perform. However, as a trainee enters the intermediate phase, they generally need to increase volume as the initial stimulus is no longer sufficient to stimulate a response. Trainees may do this by increasing how many days per week they train, increasing how many exercises are performed per session, or simply doing more sets of each exercise. An increase in volume usually leads to a faster rate of muscle growth to help them see progress once again. As trainees enter the advanced stage, volume usually doesn't need to be increased any further. Advanced lifters often train with even less volume than they previously had been in their intermediate stages. The reason for this is because advanced lifters are much more productive with each set. Each set produces a better hypertrophic stimulus compared with a beginner or intermediate lifter. This is because advanced lifters are bigger and stronger than they previously were, technique is more effective, and the training routine is individualized to what works best for themselves. So advanced lifters can probably get the same or even better stimulus with less volume. Next, let's discuss how exercise selection may differ with experience level. Beginner lifters should start by performing simple exercises that are easy to perform. Usually this means more machine-based exercises and those with low stability demands. This is to build proficiency and confidence in the gym and to positively reinforce success. Even if these exercises aren't theoretically the most effective, it doesn't really matter at this point because any stimulus will be effective. However, once beginner trainees have established some general competency, it is probably best to slowly expose them to a large range of different exercises. This will help them learn all the fundamental movement patterns and start to find which exercises they enjoy and prefer over others. As the lifter transitions to the intermediate phase, it is probably best to build the training program around the classic compound lifts like squats, bench press, deadlift, military press, pull-ups, etc. Even if these exercises aren't theoretically the most effective for hypertrophy training in all cases for all people, these exercises will efficiently build a solid foundation of both muscle and strength. If trainees can become proficient at these movement patterns and can become fairly strong at these lifts, it will likely set them up for a solid training career as a late intermediate and advanced lifter. And once lifters hit the advanced stage, this is where exercise selection becomes more nuanced. Trainees probably don't want to continue doing too many heavy compound lifts as they have probably become quite strong at them and the stimulus we get just isn't worth the fatigue cost and injury risk. For example, rather than doing barbell back squats as a quad exercise, an advanced lifter may prefer a hack squat to reduce overall fatigue while still getting an effective quad stimulus. Furthermore, advanced lifters have tried and tested many different exercises for each muscle group and have likely found which exercises provide the best stimulus specifically for them. They may find that some exercises just don't seem to provide a great stimulus for a particular muscle, or they tend to irritate certain joints, while other exercises have no joint discomfort and they provide great indicators that the stimulus was highly effective. Sometimes advanced lifters will implement exercises which may not seem to be the most theoretically effective, but they are something that the lifter has found to be a good fit specifically for them. So to conclude this video, let's summarize what we have established. Lifters can generally be categorized as either beginner, intermediate, or advanced. While there are no specific guidelines which strictly define each stage, there are general characteristics which can differentiate them. Furthermore, training should probably look slightly different during each phase of a lifting career. As a general guide, Beginner lifters usually have an external motivation for lifting, they should follow a very loose training routine, they should always prioritize technique, they don't require much volume to make progress, and should incorporate a large variety of different exercises in their routine. Intermediate lifters usually have a more internal motivation for lifting, they should follow a more rigid and prescriptive program, they should always prioritize technique, they require higher volumes to make progress, and they should focus their exercises around the fundamental compound lifts primarily. And advanced lifters usually lift only for internal reasons. They should probably follow a prescriptive but not too rigid of a training program. They should also prioritize technique. Volume requirements are around the same or maybe even less than an intermediate, and they should individualize exercise selection to suit their own individual needs. Once again, it should be understood that these are just very general guidelines. Everyone's lifting career will look slightly different and probably won't match up to these recommendations exactly. Furthermore, trainees may shift between phases at different times of their lifting career. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Check out flowhighperformance.com for online coaching, training templates, ebooks, and more.